Okay, and we are good. Everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are here tonight. Book Loft presents a conversation with. We are delighted tonight because we have a very special guest with us, Joshua Green. Josh is the author of this phenomenal book here. It's called The Rebels. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. Josh is currently the national correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek and has written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Vanity Fair. He is also the author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and The Nationalist Uprising. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yes, and I just wanted to just, off the top to say that this, everyone, we have a link here in the event box for copies of the book. You can get it, order it through bookloft.com. There is a link. This book is spectacular. It's one of the best kinds of histories that you can get in the sense that, he takes very complex and lofty and large ideas and he makes it very readable, intriguing. There are he makes the participants and the people of this book feel almost Shakespearean and like characters you would read in a novel, and that's the best kind of history. So I cannot recommend this book enough. The link is in the box. Get a copy today. And so, to begin, I want to talk about the book, which is kind of this. It is told through the lens of three individuals named in the title: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so it's a book about the kind of like the modern day, Democratic Party. But I think the thing that is most rewarding and spectacular about the book is that it's also a history of the financial crash of 2008. And I wanted to ask to start off the event, why is the financial crash of 2008 paramount into the framing of the story for these subjects? And how did its aftermath play a pivotal role in not only altering American politics, but the DNA of the Democratic Party as we see it today?
That's a terrific question. Gets exactly to the heart of why I decided to write the book. I've been a Washington political reporter for 25 years. And to me, the crash of 2008 and its aftermath was the great defining and shaping historical event in American politics, both on the right and on the left. My last book, Devil's Bargain, you mentioned, is about the rise of Donald Trump and right-wing populism. And it is inconceivable to me that we ever would have had Donald Trump had there not been a financial crash and a backlash to it, which we saw in the rise of the Tea Party movement, figures like Ted Cruz, and then eventually the emergence of Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And so what I was doing in this book, it's almost like the flip side of that story. The 2008 crash was really a rebuke to the establishments of both political parties, Democrat and Republican, because as I document the history and the rebels, both were complicit in bringing us to a state of affairs where Wall Street had so much sway over American politics. And to me, what was interesting was I wanted to write a book documenting the emergence of this left populist strain of democratic politics that emerged in the wake of the crisis. First, in the figure of Elizabeth Warren, who I write about, and then eventually in 2014, when she decides not to run for president, she handed the baton to Bernie Sanders, and then eventually to AOC, who represents the next generation of this left-wing populism. But to me, like even in real time, and you and I were talking just before we got on the air here. My job at the time in 2009, I was a political reporter for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, and I was assigned a profile of Timothy Geithner, Barack Obama's Treasury Secretary, who was kind of the brains behind the Obama administration's response to the crisis. I was also a columnist for the Boston Globe, and in that capacity, got to know Elizabeth Warren, who at the time was a very prestigious Harvard law professor who had just agreed to take on the job of being the bailout oversight cop when the government passed a law, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, bailing out the Wall Street banks. Warren was the chairman of a five-man commission that oversaw how that money was spent. And she used that platform really to push for this new kind of politics. So I sort of feel like, as a reporter, I was there at the very beginning of this movement and had a kind of a split screen view of the two sides of the Democratic Party, the centrist pro Wall Street side, and also this emerging left wing side. And that's really the story that I wanted to tell in this book, and the deeper history of how it was that the Democratic Party took this turn to the left, and kind of gave flower to this new type of politician, people like Warren, Bernie, and AOC, who are all outsiders and now have moved into the inner sanctum of Democratic politics.
And to kind of continue on this train of thought, you talk a lot about. I think it's interesting how, in a lot of ways, this book is, in some ways, a almost a biography of Elizabeth Warren. You kind of talk about her upbringing and her ascension into politics. But another person who's not in the title of the book, but as you mentioned, Timothy Geithner, the Treasury Secretary for President Obama, is a pretty lofty figure in the book, in the sense that
Yeah.
we get an understanding of who he is as a person, and where he kind of view or how he view his response to the aftermath of the collapse. And so I wanted to ask you, how does his understanding of economics and banking regulation and the banks in general, how did that kind of shape his worldview in regards to how he would deal with the response of the
Yep.
collapse, about that kind of like almost butting of heads between him and
Yes. Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah. It's another great question. Geithner was a fascinating figure, and like I said, the Obama administration agreed to let me profile him right when they took over in 2009, when we were in the depths of the great financial crash, and everybody in the government and in the Treasury was scrambling to formulate a response. And what was so interesting to me about the government's response and about Tim Geithner was that if you looked at the group of people who've been responsible for managing the economy and managing the crash under Obama's predecessor, George Bush, Geithner was one of the three key people in that team, along with Ben Bernanke and Bush's Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson. And then when Obama took over, Geithner was still one of the main guys in charge. He moved over from the New York Fed to become Obama's Treasury Secretary. And I remember being struck at the time, and sort of asking people, well, like, you know, if this guy, has come from Wall Street and has overseen the bailout, Americans are so angry and so dissatisfied with that, and Obama comes in ostensibly as kind of a breath of fresh air, somebody's going to do things differently and turn the page. How come the team that was partly responsible for the crisis is also in charge of formulating this response? And why is it? And this is the question that Warren was talking to me about, every night when we would have, coffee or whatever, would say, why is it? Ask Geithner, why is it that all of the money that the government has allotted is going to banks and it's not going to kind of people in the middle class? And so to me, that was part of the genesis for the book, was looking at, well, why is it that the Democratic Party, which has traditionally been the party of labor, was all the way up through the 1970s, fell under the sway of Wall Street and the financial community to such a degree that we had this crash. And then when we did have the crash, that the bailout really went to recapitalizing and propping up banks, and it didn't do so much for ordinary Americans. Um, the answer to your question about why they butted heads was that Tim Geithner had a very clear view of what he thought he needed to do for America and for the government in the wake of the crisis. Historically, in the past, when there have been big financial crises like this in America and in other countries, it costs an enormous amount of money to bail out all the banks and to foot the bill for all the damage that is caused. Geithner thought that Obama was going to be judged on how large is that bill that the federal taxpayers wind up paying. If it's a big bill, people will be angry and will fail. But if it's a small bill, then they'll view me and they'll view Barack Obama as a hero. And so what Geithner did was, rather than just giving out these money to banks, he took The government took warrants in these banks. The banks had to make promises to pay back this money if the economy didn't collapse. And if you fast forward about 4 or 5 years, that in fact did end up happening. Of the $800 billion that went out, a lot of that came back in. And the final price tag, I think the last time I looked, but right before we went to press, was something like 30 or $40 billion it cost American taxpayers, which is a fraction of what history said a financial crisis should cost. Um, the problem with that was Geithner was looking at this from the standpoint of a Wall Street balance sheet. When the crisis and all its effects were being felt across the country in real time by people who were losing their jobs, who were losing their retirement accounts, who were being foreclosed on and evicted from their homes. They weren't really focused on, well, how much is this going to cost me as a taxpayer? How much is this going to cost the government? They were thinking to themselves, I need help. And my elected officials and this new president, Barack Obama, that we voted for, isn't helping me. And what I see instead when I turn on the TV is all these guys in suits like Tim Geithner, and they've got all the Wall Street CEOs in the White House, and they're giving them money, but they're not giving anything to me. And I think that Geithner and Obama fundamentally misread the politics and didn't understand the backlash that was going to be caused by doing things the way they did. Uh, when the recovery when they were unable to produce a satisfying recovery for most Americans, for middle class Americans, it gave rise to this backlash that you could see almost right away. You could see the rise of Occupy Wall Street. You could see the rise of the Tea Party movement. You began to see a more extreme brand of politician, especially among Republicans running for House and Senate. And then, of course, in 2015, you have Donald Trump running for president, and you have Bernie Sanders running for president, who's very much an outsider in the Democratic Party. The fact that both of those candidates connected, and the fact that they connected on an anti-Wall Street, anti-establishment message, I think shows how unhappy Americans were with the recovery that Obama engineered. And I think that unhappiness explains a lot of what's happened in our politics over the last 15 years, where today, we've reached a state where Donald Trump is probably going to be the Republican president. The Congress can't function. I think we're going to have a government shutdown in a couple of weeks. Republicans are, pushing and then killing their own border bills. Democrats are all pulling their hair out over whether Joe Biden can get reelected and what the party should stand for and why it can't attract more support. And I think you can trace all of that back to the mishandling of the 2008 financial crisis.
And when talking about the kind of like this discontent, I thought it was really fascinating how you chronicle how when Warren kind of gets recruited to be the oversight, uh, essentially the sheriff of bank reform.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, she did something that was really interesting. I thought it was really interesting in the book that you talk about is how she kind of uses that chairmanship to kind of elevate her platform and elevate kind of like the kind of economic populist ideals that'll kind of move the party towards where it is today. But I thought it was almost kind of it's a really cool thing. And when you're reading the book, you can actually look it up on YouTube.
Mhm.
You talk about how she had used the platform to like just kind of incent or just kind of like talk to Americans about like their about what she was kind of getting through. How does that process, how did that kind of help elevate her to the kind of the rising star that she became
Yeah.
in 2012?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it in our kind of modern terms is that Elizabeth Warren was actually one of the most important and early social media influencers. That's how we would think of it today. But at the time Warren took over this job, let's back up. It was the fall of 2008. The economy had just crashed. Everybody was in a panic. Both parties were racing to put together a package before the American economy collapsed into a Great Depression. And the leaders in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, understood that in throwing together this $800 billion bailout package, the Troubled Asset Release Program, it happened so fast that they didn't even really know for sure what was in it. And so, in order to have kind of like safety rails or some kind of oversight, they put in the legislation for the TARP that there would be a 5-member oversight panel. Now, they didn't really want oversight. They didn't want somebody telling them what to do. So they didn't give this panel subpoena power, the ability to compel witnesses to come testify. So it was not viewed as a very attractive job. But Elizabeth Warren, who I think is a very shrewd person and an underappreciated historical figure, and it's one of the reasons I decided to focus on her in this book. She understood that even though this wasn't a powerful commission in terms of being able to subpoena people, it was a platform that she could use to push this new brand of left-wing populism and really lean on the Obama administration and the Wall Street banks to steer their efforts more toward the middle class. One of the ways she did this was through a very deft use of social media. If you go back to 2008, 2009, YouTube had just been invented a couple years earlier in 2006. I quote in the book a Newsweek cover story marveling at this new technology, YouTube, that featured sort of TV bloopers and piano playing cats. Like nobody really used it for anything yet. But Warren's office, when she came to Washington, was actually in a Senate office building. It was next door to a TV studio. And Warren, who's very shrewd about technology and has a lot of young students who came with her and were also very shrewd about technology, understood that she could film videos in the Senate TV studio, upload them to YouTube, and connect with American voters directly. And that's something that really hadn't happened before. And so, like you said, you can go on YouTube if you search hard enough and find these voters of Elizabeth Warren, a little cardigan sweater and her glasses, looking like this gentle Sunday school teacher. And she introduces herself and says, I'm a Harvard law professor. I'm the one who's going to be overseeing all this money that was just given out to banks. I have a lot of questions about what the banks are doing with this money, and I'm sure that you do too. And I'm going to go find out, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to hold public hearings, and I'm going to upload videos to YouTube. And I want you to follow me, reach out, follow me on Twitter, call your elected officials, what have you. I'm going to go out and get the answers that a lot of you people want. And this really connected with people. If you remember, the other piece of new technology that had just come out in 2008 was the first iPhone. It came out in 2007. So all of a sudden, people had little computers where they could watch videos and TV clips on their phone. And in pretty short order, Warren is pumping out these videos, going after not just Wall Street bankers, but also Tim Geithner and Barack Obama for not doing more for the middle class, for giving away too much to the banks. And this connected with people like me as a reporter. I saw, we're all looking for answers about what's happening, what's going on, and why. And here is a woman who is clearly very intelligent, has this position of power, and has some ability to get answers. And so the people that followed her most closely were political reporters, TV producers. As I write about in the book, Warren was discovered by Jon Stewart in The Daily Show, who, just like I did, wanted answers, had her on the show, turned her into a star, not just a political star, but really a larger figure in the American culture who could explain what was going on with Washington, why these banks were getting away with murder. And she really won over Jon Stewart, who became one of her biggest advocates. And so within the course of a year or two, Warren had given rise to a movement. We used to talk about the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party, where it wasn't just Warren, but she had other politicians who listened to her. She had a lot of the Democratic grassroots online and on social media following her. And she established what I think of as a beachhead within Democratic politics for this new left-wing version of populism that turned out to be very powerful. And in 2012, even got her elected to the Senate from Massachusetts.
And so before we kind of bring it into the present day moment, I think it'd be important to kind of take it back to the past because you write extensively about how this kind of marriage between Wall Street and the Democratic Party kind of comes to be. And the question I want to ask is, a figure that most people probably of my age, or maybe even if your age, might not be in their minds per se, is House Rep Tony Coelho.
Mm.
And can you speak to the importance of Coelho in relation to becoming chairman of the Democratic campaign committee?
Yes. So Tony Coelho, for people who don't know, was a young congressman who was elected in 1978. Very high wattage, very ambitious, a lot of charisma, hugely powerful fundraiser. And what happened was when Jimmy Carter lost his reelection race in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected. The Democratic Party went into a panic. Their traditional backbone, the labor movement, had supplied Democrats since the 1940s with votes, with organizing muscle, with money to run campaigns. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the American labor movement was in steep decline, and Democrats like Coelho knew they couldn't count on that anymore. At the same time, here was Ronald Reagan, this charismatic, telegenic figure who really understood the medium of television because he was an actor. And at the time, American politics was just moving on to television. And it became clear that having someone who is telegenic and being able to buy lots of TV commercials had helped Reagan, who, you know, back in 1978, 79, people thought of Ronald Reagan the way they thought of Donald Trump in 2013, 2014. They thought he was a sort of a funny, lightweight character from TV who could never get elected president in a million years. Well, Reagan did, and Democrats appreciated suddenly that TV was a powerful medium and they needed to be able to understand it and compete on it. But the problem with that is it takes a lot of money, and Democrats in the late 70s did not have a lot of money. Republicans did. So after, in the wake of Carter's loss, there was a kind of wholesale clearing in the House of establishment Democratic Washington. And in fact, the head of the DCCC, which is the Democratic House Campaign Committee, lost his reelection race. So suddenly that job was wide open. And Tony Coelho convinced Tip O'Neill, the Democratic House Speaker, that he was the guy for the job. And Coelho's pitch, and I tell this story in The Rebels, was he said, I can come in if you put me in charge, and I will immediately raise $5 million. And I will use that $5 million to build a small dollar fundraising machine that will help our Democratic Party and our future presidential candidates buy TV advertisements. And Tip O'Neill thought, okay, I don't have a better idea. Go ahead, Tony, you've got the job. And Coelho turned around and did exactly what he said. He started raising a lot of money. Well, he wasn't able to get money from labor or as much money as they had in the past. And so Coelho looked around for who has money, and he decided the business community has money and the financial community has money. And Coelho started courting very aggressively a lot of financial leaders who really had never heard from Democrats, right? Bankers in the 70s and 80s thought of themselves as Republicans. Here was this very charismatic Democrat coming in saying, listen, you should give me money because Democrats still control Congress. I'm going to make your life better. Coelho had a very successful sales pitch, and a lot of Wall Street figures wound up donating to them. Some of them, like Robert Rubin, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, became important fundraisers for Walter Mondale, the 1984 Democratic candidate, also gave Coelho a lot of money. And over time, Democrats became much more friendly to business. The people that Coelho tapped to raise money also started advising Democratic campaigns. And later on, when Bill Clinton was elected Democratic president in 1992, he promoted Robert Rubin from being a guy who wrote checks to a guy who is now in charge of Democratic economic policy in the White House. And so what you had was this influx of market-oriented Wall Street Democrats who simply had a different set of values than Democrats did of a generation earlier. They still claim to believe in liberal goals, um, women's rights, civil rights. They were pro-environment. But one big difference was the Democrats of an earlier generation were suspicious of Wall Street. They wanted strong financial regulations, but this new generation of pro-business Democrats did not. They thought markets were a good thing. They thought the best thing that Democrats could do was to strip away all these regulations. It did help Democrats win back political power. Bill Clinton won 2 terms. Barack Obama won 2 terms. But eventually, they undid enough of these regulations. They separated commercial investment banking by repealing Glass-Steagall. That was one of Clinton's big accomplishments. That Wall Street got out of control, and it led to this financial crash in 2008. that again, my thesis is that that shifted American politics in a way that has shaped everything that's come after it, and caused this furious backlash among Americans. And it gave rise to a group of economic populists like Warren who said, no, 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 Democrats have made a huge mistake in deferring to Wall Street. What we need to do is to reinstitute a lot of these financial controls, take Wall Street power away from Democrats, and instead put in place populists like myself, Warren, or Bernie Sanders, or AOC, who are going to use the levers of government to benefit the middle class directly. And I think that's what we've seen a lot over the last 15 years, including in Joe Biden's presidency.
Yes. And so as we kind of bring it into the future, there's just wonderful accounting of, whether Warren would run for president in 2016, and then Sanders entering the race in 2016, and the campaign, the primary campaign between himself and Clinton. So I kind of wanted to talk about, the book kind of gives this, what is it about, you know Warren's ascension into politics as a senator, and as well as the Sanders presidential run, that kind of helps kind of remove that neoliberal grip that the
Yeah.
party, or that they had on the party, and how did their ascension in politics kind of galvanize a new generation of activists, policy thinkers, in regards to where we are today?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things happen. I mean, as we've established, Warren used her platform as the bailout oversight cop, and used social media really to introduce this kind of new anti-Wall Street, pro-middle class version of left-wing populism that turned out to be very popular. It was popular in the culture. It was popular especially with younger Democrats in the blogosphere. And once she got elected to the Senate, Warren was really a voice of authority on matters of banking and financial regulation. She knew how to get attention to her causes. If you've ever seen Elizabeth Warren in an oversight hearing where maybe the witness is, a Wall Street CEO or a banker or something like that, she had a real talent for engineering these kind of viral showdowns where she would, uh, uh, kind of shame or embarrass these Wall Street folks. And these things would immediately go viral on social media. And pretty soon, Democratic elected officials came to understand that, wow, this is a really powerful woman. We don't want to get crosswise with her. So when Warren said, I think Democrats should support this bill, or I don't think Democrats should support that bill, a lot of people went along with her because she was a celebrity politician at that point. And as Barney Frank, a Massachusetts congressman and a Democrat, and a friend of Warren's told me, around 2013, 2014, Elizabeth Warren was probably the most powerful Democrat next to Barack Obama because everybody was afraid to cross her. And so the question then became, will Elizabeth Warren run for president in 2016? At the time, everybody expected that Hillary Clinton was going to run for president, and that if she did, it would probably be a coronation. But there was a lot of excitement and a lot of pressure on this new emergent left wing of the party for Warren to get into the race. I remember, talking to Warren at the time and meeting with her staffers and saying, why don't you guys do this? Like, clearly you've got a movement. If you ran, maybe Clinton isn't as strong as a politician as you think. Maybe you can get the nomination. Or, if you run and you don't win, your ideas will get a broader hearing. And if they prove to be popular, maybe Hillary Clinton will have to adopt them, and even if she gets elected, a lot of your ideas will make it into the White House. But I think Elizabeth Warren at that time fundamentally didn't want to be president. She was a Harvard law professor. She was a senator. And the entire establishment of the Democratic Party in 2015, 2016 was controlled by the Clinton apparatus. And so she wound up not running. And when she made the decision not to run, Bernie Sanders, who also represented a lot of Warren's ideas, thought, well, you know what? If she's not going to get in the race, then I'll get in the race. And Sanders' goal initially was simply to, as he said to me, to move the Democratic Party to the left by forcefully pushing the kind of left-wing populist economic ideas that Warren had before him. And lo and behold, I don't think anybody expected this, but within a month of Sanders entering the race, he catches fire in a way that nobody saw coming. And he goes from speaking to, a few hundred people to a few thousand people to filling giant arenas. I don't know if viewers remember the Summer of Bernie, it was called, but all of a
Oh yeah.
sudden, Bernie is traveling around filling stadiums and getting bigger crowds than Hillary Clinton was. And all of those people showing up at the stadium were excited enough for his candidacy that they were also willing to send him a lot of small donor checks, right? Bernie Sanders never had to go to Wall Street to ask for money. So in an ironic sort of way, Bernie Sanders wound up fulfilling the ideas that Tony Coelho had 15, 20 years earlier. Coelho had said, we need to build this small dollar fundraising machine, and I'm going to tap Wall Street. Well, that didn't turn out well. But Bernie came along in 2015, 2016 and said, I'm going to run for president. I'm going to excite, millions of younger Americans all over the country, and they're going to become this small dollar fundraising machine. And to everyone's astonishment, and I mean everyone in Washington politics, Bernie Sanders raised more than $200 million in that campaign. He actually raised more money than Hillary Clinton did, wound up winning 23 states. And while he didn't win the nomination in 2016, what he did was prove that this left populist movement was strong enough and large enough and powerful enough that Democrats couldn't ignore it anymore. And so even though Clinton lost, you saw Warren and Sanders both get elevated into Senate Democratic leadership. And the Democratic Party as a whole, which never believed that Donald Trump could get elected, was absolutely certain until, 10 p.m. on election night that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. When she failed and when Trump was elected, I think it caused a mass reckoning among the Democratic establishment that collectively said, and I was in some of these conversations, oh my God, what has happened? How could a guy like this ever get elected? What are Americans thinking? We must have misread the country and what they really want. And to their credit, politicians like Joe Biden recognized that mistake and adjusted. And so by the time Biden runs for president in 2020, even though he ran as a centrist or a moderate, I should say, against Warren and Bernie Sanders, if you look at what he stood for policy-wise, it was actually a lot of their ideas. We need to reinvest in the middle of the country. We need to reshore manufacturing jobs. We need to keep jobs here at home. We need to impose tariffs on China. We need to make sure that the interests of the middle class and the working class are at the forefront, not the interests of Wall Street. And once Joe Biden got elected, that's exactly what he did. And one irony of my history is that it's sort of bookended by two different financial crises, right? We talked about 2008, 2009. That was a big financial crisis. It sort of showed Democrats what not to do in the aftermath. But then you have the great COVID crash of 2020, where the economy collapsed, even worse than it has in '08. Only this time, Democrats learned once Joe Biden got into office that they couldn't make the same mistakes again. And so, what does Biden do when he gets into office? He doesn't bail out Wall Street banks. He passes 3 successive rounds of stimulus focused on the middle class. He freezes student loans, imposes an eviction moratorium. He and the Congress and both parties give all sorts of loans to small businesses to keep them afloat, to keep them from laying off workers. And they produce a recovery that, 3 years after the fact, all of the jobs lost have been recovered. Unemployment is at record lows. Unemployment hasn't been this low since the Eisenhower administration. We have the stock market at record highs. Every economic number that I see is booming, even though political sentiment isn't that high. It did cause a bout of inflation, which is politically painful and is probably the biggest impediment to Joe Biden winning another term. But in terms of the damage to the economy, it's been nothing like the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And I think that owes largely to the influence of the characters that I write about in the book and the way that they have been able over the last 15 years to steer the Democratic Party in a more middle class focused direction, to distinguish it from what it was in 2009, 2010, when Americans were so unhappy that they created this big political backlash.
And so before we get to questions, I'm going to ask just a couple more because I want to talk about the third subject of the book, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is elected into Congress in 2018, and as you're talking, the way that the book kind of reads, it comes across as um, there's like this perfect storm of a moment for her as a candidate.
Yes. Yeah.
The advent of social media, the fact that small dollar donations can essentially she could mount a campaign of small dollar donations. You talk about in the book two subjects, Alfred Johnson and Alan Kramer, who
Mhm.
developed social media apps that help with campaigning and canvassing. Um, how did these kind of like uh, different X factors kind of help propel her, or at least give her a fighting chance to elevate herself into mainstream American politics?
Yeah, it's a great question. So after the 2016 election and Donald Trump's win, um, Democrats collectively, after this moment of horror, went through a process of introspection and tried to figure out what had gone wrong and how could they fix it. One of the answers for Democrats on what had gone wrong was that Clinton had not managed to appeal to young people, and she had not managed to appeal to racial minorities in quite the degree that Democrats had hoped. And so I tell the story in the book of the technology that developed in the wake of that. I follow a small company called Mobilize America, run by two young 20-something business school graduates who decided to go out and solve that problem. Why was it that Democrats weren't reaching young people, and why was it that they weren't reaching racial minorities? And what they concluded was that those are two distinct demographic groups that aren't really reachable by the traditional ways that Democrats conduct politics. So the way they would do it in a normal election is Democrats would call you up on a landline and you get the sort of robocall encouraging you to vote for Hillary Clinton. Or they would run 30-second TV ads over linear TV. The problem is young people don't subscribe to cable anymore. None of them have landlines. They're all very transient, so you can't knock on their door. But what do they have? We talked about this earlier. They've all got an iPhone. Same thing, racial minorities. A lot of black voters tend to um, either move around or not have cable or don't answer the door when you knock, or just aren't as easily reachable through these mediums as Democrats would like them to be, but they've all got iPhones or some kind of cell phone. And so Mobilize went out and basically invented an organizing app that can be downloaded on the phone. They tested this out in 2017 in Virginia. I was sort of along for the ride. It turned out to work beautifully. All the young people, minorities showed up, voted. The Democrats came storming back in the Virginia State House elections, did really well. The Democratic Party writ large saw the success, and they took the technology and they applied it to a lot of congressional campaigns in 2018. We all remember what happened in those campaigns. Democrats won back the House, did very well. So when it comes to AOC, she's a really interesting story because she's part of this younger generation, of radical activists who are really pulled into Democratic politics by Bernie Sanders. AOC, as I tell the story in the book, was a Sanders volunteer and was very moved by his campaign, moved to run her own campaign, what was thought to be a kind of a no hope, long shot congressional campaign against a guy named Joe Crowley, who was the third or fourth ranking Democrat in Congress from New York. Everybody expected him to be the next Speaker of the House after Nancy Pelosi retired. But AOC was a wonderful organizer. She had technologists on her campaign who built her an app so that they could go out and find voters in the district. They would go to subway platforms, they would go to bars, they would go to pizza restaurant and kind of input your data right into your phone. Nobody had done this in 2017 and 2018 when AOC was and her team were doing it. And she got just enough votes on primary election night to defeat Joe Crowley, which was like a thunderbolt. I mean, nobody in the world thought Crowley was going to lose. People were so sure that Crowley was going to win that most media hadn't even covered the race and didn't even RSVP to AOC's election party. There were only a couple of reporters there. So I think it shows the power that this new technology had to reach young people who could organize, who could get elected to Congress. And I don't want to drone on for too long here, but I also tell the story in the book of how AOC arrived in Congress as really a radical activist, occupied Nancy Pelosi's office with the Sunrise Movement environmental activists, had a tough adjustment period in Congress, but has really emerged as a powerful figure in her own right, a sort of Elizabeth Warren 2.0 in her fluency in using social media to reach a big audience, to build a movement, to help press for issues that she cares about, like environmentalism and a Green New Deal. And that too has had its effect on Democratic politics and on Joe Biden's presidency in a way that I think is very much to her credit.
And so before we open it up for questions to the public, I just want my last question for you. Um, should Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, run for election in 2024 and 2026, respectively? I believe something to the effect they will both end their terms at both 80 and 88 years old, respectively, right?
Mhm.
And so I think it'd be fair to assume that, we are kind of witnessing like the last, years of
Mhm.
both members in the Senate. So who do you see as kind of picking up that baton, besides, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who in the Senate or in the House do you see kind of picking up that baton of economic populism on the left?
It's a great question. It's interesting. There's a lot of buzz in Washington right now. I live and work in Washington. A lot of buzz in Washington right now about why Bernie Sanders hasn't declared that he's running for re-election. As you mentioned, he's older than Joe Biden, and he'd be 88 at the end of his second term. So I think that there's a real feeling that he's probably not going to run again. Hasn't announced it yet, but that he's going to retire. Warren is a good deal younger than Sanders. I don't know when she's up off the top of my head. Let me think. 2018, 20. Is she up in 2024?
Yeah, she'd be running this fall for re-election.
Yeah.
If she were to finish that term, she would finish at
Yes.
80 years old.
So I believe she's going to run. She's going to run for this fall. Would then finish at 80 years old. But certainly she's in the sort of a downward slope of her political career. And the question about who comes next, it's a great one. It's a wide open one. Certainly, like of all the significant figures in Democratic politics, AOC is the youngest, and most of them are very old. Whether you're talking about Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. They're all well into their 70s or 80s. And so there's a time in the not too distant future when all of them are going to move off the stage. AOC will be the only one left. But as far as the kind of left-wing economic populism that I write about, it's an interesting question. I mean, elements of this have been taken up by other members of the squad, although they're not really thought of as economic populists quite to the degree that AOC is. But what's most interested me is the fact that Joe Biden has taken up a lot of these economic policies. And I think the future of these ideas, I do think that AOC will run for president one day and articulate a lot of them. But I think the likelier path to these ideas getting in the White House is the next generation of politicians, sort of more moderate, mainstream seeming Democrats, whether it's Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or maybe a senator like Raphael Warnock from Georgia, people who have a kind of a broader appeal across the party than maybe an AOC or a Bernie Sanders does. I think that they're going to look at the success of these ideas in turning around the economy after the COVID crisis, in keeping unemployment low, in creating jobs and satisfying economic life for workers in the American middle class. They're going to see this revitalized labor movement that Joe Biden has also been a part of. And I think those ideas are going to appeal to them. So a lot depends on what happens this November. If Joe Biden wins re-election, I think it's really going to validate this brand of Democratic politics. And I think what you'll see after that is that whoever runs for the Democratic nomination in 2028, and it's going to be a long, long list of people. I think they'll take up these populist left policies because they'll have seen that even a kind of a pro-corporate moderate Democrat like Joe Biden can get elected to two terms on these ideas and govern successfully. If he loses, though, then I do think that these ideas might be discredited to an extent that people will say, whoa, Biden spent too much money, he did too much stimulus, it caused inflation. It cost him the race. Maybe we better not go in this direction. But, you know, so much hangs on the outcome of the 2024 election that it's really hard to kind of predict Democratic or Republican future because we just don't know um, which party is going to win and who's going to be in the White House come next January.
And with that, I will now open it up to folks watching, and let's see what we have in terms of questions. Stephen asks, what would have happened if Warren had run for president in
Ooh, I love this question.
2016? Could she have also maybe have been vice president? Question mark.
I love this question. I almost feel like it must have been planted because I write about it in the book at great length. So I think that if Warren ran for president in 2016, I really do think there's a chance that she would have beaten Hillary Clinton. And if she did, possibly beaten Donald Trump. If you look at Clinton's weakness as a candidate in hindsight, and you look at her vulnerability, a lot of it was on this economic populist front. There was a lot of, I don't know, people remember these little micro scandals, but there was a lot of controversy at the time Clinton got in the race because she was giving these highly paid private speeches to Goldman Sachs right before she got in and refused to let people know or let reporters in or what she was talking about. So there was a real sense that she was kind of in hock to these Wall Street banks and maybe couldn't be trusted. And all you have to do is look at Bernie Sanders' emergence and the surprising strength he showed as a candidate in the 2016 primaries to see, well, look, this is a brand that a lot of Democrats believed in. I think if Warren had run, Bernie wouldn't have run, and therefore she might have challenged Clinton directly. She was much more of a mainstream Democrat at the time, even though she was a left populist. She didn't describe herself as a socialist the way that Bernie did. So I think she would have had an even broader appeal than he did. And if we had had instead of a Clinton versus Trump, a Warren versus Trump, couldn't predict how that would go, but it would have been wild, but Warren wouldn't have been vulnerable on these issues of middle class concerns in the way that Trump does. And I think that she probably would have been a better candidate than Hillary Clinton was. So maybe we would have had a President Warren. On the question of whether she or not she'd be a vice president, I actually tell the story. There was a secret campaign to court Warren for vice president, for Clinton's vice president. She was actually vetted and a couple of Clinton advisors really thought that Warren would be the best pick to be vice president because she would have inoculated Clinton against these charges that Clinton was too pro Wall Street. If people say, oh, well, you give speeches to Goldman Sachs, she could say, well, look, Elizabeth Warren is my vice president. And if she believes in me, then you should believe in me too. I even got leaked to me, and I quote this in the book, a memo from one of Clinton's campaign staffers at the time saying, your strongest vice presidential candidate would be Elizabeth Warren. And in the course of reporting the book, I actually got to interview Warren in her condo at some point. I guess this is in 2019. And I asked her, I said, if Clinton had asked you to be vice president, what would you have said? And she looked me in the eye and said, I would have said yes. So, another alternate history that is fun to think about, but that didn't wind up happening.
What's that like? Is there what's she serving as she's inviting into the house?
I weirdly remember that she served me homemade mango lemonade that was absolutely delicious.
Wow,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me ask. Let's see what we got. Um, Allison asks, what do you think will happen to AOC in the future? Do you think she runs for president, maybe the Senate, or is she out of politics altogether?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, talking to people in Democratic politics and people in New York, AOC is widely admired for her political talent, but she's also viewed as a left-wing radical Democrat. And that's fine for her current House district. Politically, ethnically, in terms of like the age and the propensities of voters there, she can keep getting reelected at her House seat for as long as she wants to. But if you broaden out and look at statewide office in New York, and you look at all those upstate New Yorkers, there's a lot of suspicion of New Yorkers, like people from New York City generally, and there's a particular suspicion of people they believe are radicals. And the Democrats I've talked to in New York think she would have a very hard time winning statewide office. So she might decide to run for Senate. But I don't think that that's necessarily the path forward for her. So if she's not satisfied just being in the House, she can't run for Senate, she can't win statewide, she can't be governor. I think there are two possible paths that she might want to pursue. One, she could run for mayor of New York City, or two, she could follow in the footsteps of her political mentor, Bernie Sanders, and in 2028 run a factional campaign for the Democratic nomination and hope to reanimate a lot of the Bernie Sanders coalition and, attract left-wing Democrats, young people, all the sorts of people that aren't satisfied with a mainstream establishment Democratic candidate. So who knows? We may see her running for president in 2028. I kind of think that she will because it's not a fun job being a minority member of the U.S. House. You have no power. As everybody can see, the House is completely dysfunctional, doesn't get anything done. If you want a bigger influence, you need a bigger platform, and there's nothing bigger. No platform is bigger than running for U.S. president. So that's what I'm hoping to see in the years ahead.
And then let's see. Let's get one more in before we wrap up. Let me see. Um, um, okay, so Jacob asks, is it easier for progressives to get ideas passed with more moderate support, or should they remain steadfast in their beliefs?
It's a great question, and it's a question that all three of my characters, Warren, Bernie, and AOC, have all had to confront at different points in their career, and they've all come to the same realization that if you want to affect change, if you want to change the laws in a direction that comports with your beliefs, you have to cooperate with moderates because that's just the way the U.S. political system works. Um, Bernie Sanders for the first 8 years I covered him from 2000 until sort of 2008, 2009, did not compromise. And he wasn't a very popular figure among his Democratic peers because he didn't. You'd often have votes in the Senate that were like 400 to 1, and Bernie would be the one guy who didn't vote. But I think after he ran for president and saw the movement he'd built and saw the power that he had, he wanted to translate that political capital, into advancing the ideas that he cared about and that all his followers cared about. And I think very much to his credit, he worked with Joe Biden to convince Biden to adopt a lot of them. I think AOC traveled an even broader path. As we talked about earlier, when she first got elected to Congress, she occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. She was a radical activist, wanted to pass this Green New Deal. For the first 6 months of her congressional campaign, or sorry, for the first 6 months of her congressional term, she stuck to her guns, didn't moderate, didn't compromise, and didn't accomplish anything. So I think what's really interesting about her story, and very much to her credit, is that she reassessed what she was doing and why she was there and decided, I may not get the entire Green New Deal the way I want it written, but if I work with Joe Biden's White House, I'll be able to advance those ideas. And I think that AOC's greatest political achievement, which isn't really reported much or written about, was that she was among the group that managed to get a $300 billion climate bill, the largest climate bill in US history, was part of what Joe Biden's larger package called the Inflation Reduction Act. Incredibly important environmental bill that never would have gone anywhere if AOC and people like her had said, we're not going to compromise. You either give us the whole loaf or nothing at all. Instead, we've had these gains, and I think she's learned how to be an effective congresswoman. So I think any path forward, unless progressives can win The presidency and such large Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, they can kind of pass anything they want. The only real path to achieving tangible legislative political goals is through cooperating with moderates in their own party.
It almost feels like, in certain respects, you know, Warren and Sanders and AOC, while Warren and Sanders may have lost the battle for the presidency, they've kind of won the war of policy and helping kind of getting in the ear of Joe Biden.
I think that's right. I mean, you look at Biden's presidency and what he's been able to accomplish in terms of their ideas, not just get it, put it into law, but do it in a 50-50 Senate with a Republican Party that absolutely does not want to cooperate with anything that Democrats do. And I think it's a remarkable achievement for these three characters. So anyway, that's actually sort of where the book ends. So if you want to learn more about the story, give the book a read. I should also say, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question tonight and still want to ask me something, I'm at Twitter at Joshua Green. I'm also at Blue Sky. I don't know if any of you guys do Blue Sky.
This guy.
I'm at Blue Sky at Joshua Green or Joshua.Green. But I'm out there. Would love to hear from you. And thanks so much for tuning in. And thank you so much for hosting this book talk. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much. And once again, the book is The Rebels: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Struggle for a New American Politics. This book is phenomenal, phenomenal, people. There is a link in the description box. You can get a copy from bookloft.com. Get it today. Josh, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.